Okay, welcome to the second National Adaptation Forum. My name is Alex Score. I'm a scientist with EcoAdapt, and I will help moderate the session today. The National Adaptation Forum webinar series was created after we conducted a follow-up survey from the inaugural National Adaptation Forum, which was held in Denver in 2013. Forum attendees and practitioners asked for ways to be able to engage with each other between conferences. The webinars are held quarterly so we can continue discussing how to move adaptation forward. If you'd like to recommend a topic or are interested in partnering and co-hosting a webinar, please contact myself at alex@ecoadapt.org. We have a quick announcement. We have a save the date announcement for the second National Adaptation Forum, which will be held in St. Louis, Missouri, May 12th through 14th in 2015. If you have not done so, please join the National Adaptation Forum mailing list to receive updated information, call for proposals, and registration information when available. There will also be a California Adaptation Forum, which will take place this year, August 19th through the 20th. For more information on that, our panel members will be speaking about it, but also you can look it up at californiaadaptationforum.org. A couple housekeeping rules for us today. It is best to use your telephone to call in. Usually the audio is better that way. Please make sure to put your phone on mute or cell phone on mute after you do call in, even if it shows on the computer that you're already on mute. This will help reduce any feedback. If you cannot use your telephone and you need to use the speakers and microphone voice over IP option, please ensure that you place your computer on mute immediately after logging in. We will have plenty of time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. Throughout the webinar, you can use the questions function to submit your questions to the panel members. We will do our best to answer all of them, and if we don't get to all of them, we will send out questions to our panel members, and we will post them on the webinar website at a later date. You can also raise your hand in the control panel to ask a question, and we will unmute you so you can ask a question to the panel members. There is a chat function right below the question tab. You can see it on the bottom of your control panel. You can use that to report to me or to our other organizers any technical issues you might be encountering during the webinar. We will try to address any of these problems to ensure that you have a favorable experience today. The chat function can also be used to communicate between yourselves, attendees, as a way to emphasize the points that you heard during the presentations. We encourage you to engage with your fellow colleagues that way. But please only use the questions tab to ask questions for our panel members. Finally, I wanted to let you know that we will be recording the webinar today and posting the webinar in the EcoAdapt and the CAKE website for future uses. These should be available next week, and they can be viewed on the ecoadapt.org website and the cakex.org site. Without further ado, let me introduce our panel members today. Amber Paris currently serves as the Assistant Secretary for Climate Change, California Natural Resources Agency, where she's responsible for assisting in the development and implementation of California's strategy for adapting to future climate change impacts and assisting in development and implementation of California strategies to reduce climate risks. She's also responsible for assisting with the design of climate tools to support natural resource management and decision-making, which requires a significant level of coordination both within state agencies as well as with federal, tribal, and other interested stakeholders. Michael McCormick is a senior planner and serves as a local and regional affairs advisor at the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. His focus is at the nexus of local government and state policy, where he works on greenhouse gas emissions mitigation, climate change adaptation, preparedness, sustainability, tools resource development, and communication issues. He's actively working to institutionalize the consideration of climate change across agencies and organizations at the state, regional, and local level. Michael has experience working in academic, local government, and consulting capacities, and has been on boards of several nonprofits, including Sustainability Academy, the American Planning Association, and the Association of Environmental Professionals. Last but not least, Laura Hansen is the Chief Scientist and Executive Director of EcoAdapt, which she co-founded back in 2008 to build the field of climate change adaptation. She is co-author and editor of one of the earliest texts on the issue of natural system adaptation to climate change, Buying Time, a user's manual for building resistance and resilience to climate change and natural systems, as well as co-author of one of the newest books on adaptation, Climate Savvy, Adapting Conservation and Resource Management to a Changing World. The team that created these books also created an engaged stakeholder process, first known as Climate Camp, now known as Awareness to Action Workshops, to help resource managers create adaptation strategies applicable to their work. And now, without further ado, Laura Hansen.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, as the case may be. The topic of today's session is Safeguarding California, a state's updated adaptation plan. In the run-up to that, I'm going to provide an overview of the state of state adaptation plans. It's very exciting to have you all here with us today. It's always pleasant to scroll through the list of attendees and see how many people I know who are listening in. The state of state adaptation plans is, I'm not certain that I have control to change. Whitney, can you give me control? Thanks. I'll start out by giving you sort of the lay of the land. Currently, 36 states have completed climate action plans, plus the District of Columbia. 2 states are in progress, and the remaining states have not yet undertaken this. What's interesting is if you look at the pattern of states that have not yet undertaken state adaptation plans, it's very similar to the pattern of states that did not attend the National Adaptation Forum in 2013. Probably not too surprising, but clearly shows that that is a region of the country where we need to be doing more work on engaging people on this important issue. 2 examples that I want to sort of highlight are, you have the state of Florida on here, which first created its state adaptation plan almost 6 years ago, and has not revisited it. And in fact, there doesn't seem to be a continuing mandate to try and figure out whether the actions in it are implemented. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have California, who we'll be talking about today, who created a state adaptation plan at about the same time and has now seen fit to go back and update that plan because conditions have changed and needs have changed. One of the things about adaptation plans is that they themselves must be adaptive. And part of the process of implementing them must be to revisit them and make sure that they're still meeting the needs and the state of the science. Part of the mandate for getting people thinking about state adaptation plans and the like and creating the lay of the land that made people interested have been 2 presidential actions. One was an executive order from 2009, and the other is the President's Climate Action Plan from 2013. The first specifically mandated federal agencies to create their own plans of adaptation. At this point, all of those agencies have created their plans, and they're now working on creating their plans to implement their plans. And part of that has involved their interactions with state and state agencies. And that has fostered some of this activity that leads to those activities that we're going to be talking about happening in states today. The President's Climate Action Plan actually explicitly includes support for communities preparing for climate change. And as part of that is some of the state efforts, because there are a few governors involved in that process as well. So driving factors in creating state plans vary. In some states, it's been a keen awareness of fiscal or economic concerns. I would say that in California, that is one of the reasons for creating an adaptation plan is that the economy could be seen to be vulnerable. If we allow Mike and Amber to talk about what they're experiencing today in terms of drought and what that means not only for agriculture but other businesses in the state, it's very dramatic. And creating a plan to deal with that is going to be very important. Coupled with that are health and safety concerns. These have generally been less of a driver. However, once states or local groups or whoever is coming up with an adaptation plan starts digging into it, there are clear drivers about this. If one looks at the East Coast and responses to Hurricane Sandy and the plans that have come out of that, clearly health and safety were tightly coupled with economic concerns. Cultural concerns are another big driver in developing adaptation plans. This has been prominent in tribal adaptation plans, but it's also seen in the California Adaptation Plan when one looks at some of the activities that fall under the auspices of the Parks and Recreation programs, which is where some of the cultural mandate lies. In most of the cases where state adaptation plans happened early, there were visionary leaders involved. There was someone at some level of government, not necessarily the governor, who said this is something important we need to be doing. And you can almost always pinpoint a few individuals who were willing to take the risk and step up and say this is something we need to do. And finally, in some cases, there's mandate for it, either because there's legislative action, gubernatorial action, or some other mandate that is interpreted to mean that there needs to be a state adaptation plan. Despite the fact that there are 36 existing state action plans, plus the District of Columbia, there still are gaps and barriers. Last year, a group of us put out a report called The State of Adaptation in the United States that included partners at the University of Washington, the University of California, and the Georgetown Climate Center. And there also was a follow-up piece by the Georgetown Climate Center in relation to lessons from Hurricane Irene. And from those two documents, there were a series of current gaps and barriers that are making the effectiveness of those adaptation plans, that are challenging the effectiveness of those adaptation plans. One is a remarkable lack of implementation. Most of these plans have great ideas presented in them, but don't necessarily go through how will it be implemented or testing the implementation of it, and I'll get a little bit more to that in a moment. The second thing is capacity to do the work of adaptation, either because agencies and programs are understaffed or undertrained. There aren't the people that are needed to do the work. Cross-sectoral linkages are often left out. If you look at a lot of the early adaptation plans, they're done in a very sectoral manner, and there wasn't planning between groups. So it could be that planning and inland planning were done separately, despite the fact that climate change has implications that go across the two of those. Water management and agriculture may have been done separately. Things like that where you really need the cross-sectoral linkages to get long-term success. The third is that monitoring and evaluation piece to assess and improve practice. A lot of plans are laid out there with nothing put in place to say, is it working? The third is overcoming uncertainty, figuring out how you deal with the fact that there is inherent uncertainty in what the future will bring, but building in methodologies that allow for that checking in and course correction. Very few of those are happening at the state level. There are many examples of where people are starting to do it at the local level, including one in California in the South Bay Salt Ponds project, where they have in checkpoints for what do you do as sea level rise increases, how do you correct for the way that management is taking place. Funding. That's not just saying more money is needed, it's also figuring out how to use the funding that you already have to do what you've indicated needs to be done. So going beyond adding to things, but rather revisiting how do you do the work you already do and how do you make that adaptive. Recognizing that adaptation is needed. There are a lot of areas where people are still working and not recognizing that this is an issue that needs to be worked on, or believing that it's an issue that could be worked on in the future. Sort of getting the word out to all of the sectors in a state, all of the agencies, all levels of agencies, that it's something that needs to be worked on. And finally, there are outdated conflicting regulations. There are frequent, and this is brought up many times in the Lessons from Irene document, that there are many places where existing regulations prevent the ability to do new adaptation activities. And figuring out how we get around that is going to be very important. So I can't speak for all of the panel members because we did not caucus on this, but these are sort of my interpretations of what are the needed actions to move this forward. Making sure that we don't just stop with a plan. Much as the federal agencies are now developing their implementation plans to implement their adaptation plans, we need to make sure that implementation is clearly part of it. And if you look at the adaptation ladder of engagement, which is here as stair steps for you because it's graphically more pleasing, you can see that the planning step is less than halfway up where you want to get to really have implemented integrated adaptation. And we need to make sure that people aren't believing that a plan is an end product. Identifying key partners with common and conflicting goals in order to come up with those approaches that get to long-term success. So you want to plan not only with the people that have the same goals in the same area, but think more broadly. What are the other sectors that might have implication for what you're doing? And finally, to take advantage of existing mandates and funding to support action. Don't wait for the something new. So good examples of, good examples that are out there of states that have adaptation plans that get at some of these issues include New York, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, the state of Washington. And for today, we really want to focus on the state of California and talk about what's going on in California. So I'm going to pass the presentation over to Amber. Amber, do you now have controls? Because I don't think I do any longer.
Let's try. I'm not able to advance the slide unless there's a very long delay.
Okay, Whitney, can you please take over advancing of slides? Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, or as Laura said, it might be afternoon for some of you. I appreciate the earlier introduction from Alex and for Laura really setting the stage on where we are with adaptation. For those of you I don't know, my name is Amber Paris, and I'm the California Natural Resource Agency. And really appreciate this opportunity to be here to provide an update on our Safeguarding California plan to prepare for climate risks, which is an update to our 2009 California Climate Adaptation Strategy. And I think this will be a really nice kind of segue from what Laura set up, and that I'll kind of talk about the big picture of what we're doing at the statewide level. And then we have Michael McCormick on, who's been doing some really innovative and creative work with local entities and be able to really drill down. And we hope today to really paint a picture for you of our kind of more holistic effort to address climate risk within the state of California. As many of you know, California has already been taking really aggressive actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with our landmark legislation in 2006 of Assembly Bill 32. But we recognize, at all levels of government that no matter how quickly we reduce our climate polluting emissions, impacts will still unfold as a result of the emissions that have already occurred. Bigger and more intense wildfires, floods, severe storms, heat waves, are already occurring and expected to become more frequent and dangerous. But we also anticipate that there are going to be additional risks to California's people, its economy, its infrastructure, and natural resources that we need to take really diligent actions to reduce these impacts. So taking these steps to prepare for risk in combination with our efforts to reduce emissions can help reduce the magnitude of impacts and create more resilient and sustainable communities. So the 2009 California Climate Adaptation Strategy, which Laura mentioned, and I hope that many of you are familiar with, was developed pursuant to a 2008 governor's executive order that called for the California Natural Resource Agency to develop this strategy. And I will argue, Laura, and we can go back and look at dates, but that California's was the very first multi-sector plan for preparing for climate risk that was specifically focused on adaptation. And I think, in California, we really have a lot to be proud of as the strategies and innovative thinking that went into that plan continue to be relevant and repeated as climate plans are developed around the country. But we recognize that a lot has happened since 2009. The science is evolving as well as our understanding of climate risk continues to improve. And in addition to the science, we have state departments, agencies, local government, and other partners around the state who have been exploring and refining management strategies to prepare for risk and to build more resilient communities. And there is an incredible number of really innovative and creative partnerships and projects that are taking shape around the state. So the time is really right for the state to really get our house in order, to update our vision and our plan for preparing for climate risk. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So I'm pleased to announce that our first draft of our safeguarding plan was released in December and will be out for public comment until the end of February. And we worked really diligently, collaboratively within state government and reaching out to local government to really lay out what we feel are early actions on climate change impacts that will make a major difference in California's ability to cope with rising seas, extreme weather, and other impacts. And we believe these are really thoughtful actions now that will save lives and money in the future. An important thing to say about this plan is that this draft plan is a policy guidance document for state decision makers, and it's part of our continuing efforts to reduce these impacts associated with climate change. And I'll also emphasize that the Safeguarding California plan does not replace our 2009 adaptation strategy, but really builds upon those previous strategies and integrates new information. And we anticipate that a final plan will be completed in the spring of 2014. Before jumping into kind of a preview of what's actually in the draft, I do want to talk a little bit about how the safeguarding plan fits into our broader suite of state actions to address climate change. The Governor's Office of Planning and Research has been leading the development of our Environmental Goals and Policy Report, which we really think of as the umbrella that encompasses the state's vision for the future. And underneath that umbrella, there are sort of three core areas or three legs of the stool for how we can implement that vision. And that's focused on reducing emissions through the scoping plan, preparing for impacts with the safeguarding plan, and research to inform decisions or our policies, which is embodied in our state research plan. So the scoping plan, again, is really associated with the mitigation side. It guides the development and implementation of our greenhouse gas emissions reduction program, and this 2013 update that was just released last week really lays out the scientific and technological foundation to ensure sustainable midterm and long-term emissions reductions, as well as public health and economic goals. The safeguarding plan, which we'll again talk a little bit more, is about addressing climate risks. And then the research plan is really the state's long-term view of our research needs with an emphasis on the next 3 to 5 years. So again, the safeguarding plan is kind of one element of this larger statewide coordinated effort or vision that's focused on preparing for and reducing climate risks. And the safeguarding plan really is kind of an integral part of that statewide approach. The next slide. Oh, maybe I do have control of the slide. Thank you. So I'll talk a little bit more about the Environmental Goals and Policy Report, which is a document that is actually out for public comment right now, and it's really kind of the heart and soul of moving forward in a really collaborative and coordinated way. So I'll just talk a little bit about the goals. So the goals of the EGPR is really to provide that vision for the state's future, to outline the cross-cutting goals for the next several decades, to link goals to metrics and indicators, and to do all of that in the context of population growth and climate change. So again, I'm going to throw up for you the cross-cutting goals from that EGPR to again just show you how those three legs of the stool are really integral part of achieving this larger vision for the state. In addition to our efforts here in California, the state is also working with our federal partners on similar national effort. Laura mentioned the President's Task Force. Pursuant to the President's Climate Action Plan, the task force of state, local, and tribal leaders was convened. There are several California representatives on this President's Task Force, including Governor Brown, Supervisor Carvajal from Santa Barbara, Mayor Garcetti from Los Angeles, and Mayor Kevin Johnson from Sacramento. So we have a very strong presence on this task force and are really focused on supporting this effort and helping to identify recommendations for this process to help remove barriers, create incentives, tools, and more generally identify ways for the federal entities to better support the states, local government, and our tribes. I've talked a little bit about kind of the statewide approach with EGPR and just now this coordination with the federal and national level, but there are also a number of very sector-specific climate efforts that have been ongoing in California and really form kind of a critical piece of stepping down the vision to actions on the ground. So this slide is only a very small sampling of a lot of really innovative and exciting efforts that are taking place. And I do want to emphasize the large number. And I think Michael will talk a little bit more about this, but Michael's been helping to sort of caretake and pull together a chart that illustrates the state climate planning efforts. And I think it's really easy to look at that list and feel really overwhelmed because there's just so much happening. But the other sort of side of the coin, I also think it's really positive because it speaks to the fact that we in state government and in California are very serious about addressing climate change and figuring out how we mainstream climate into everything that we do. So again, this slide just gives you a few examples, but gives you a little bit of flavor of how these larger statewide efforts are being stepped down into actions on the ground. So things like our state sea level rise guidance document. Our California Department of Food and Ag has pulled together an agricultural climate change consortium with recommendations for specialty crops. Our California Department of Public Health has put out extreme heat guidance. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife has a climate college to build capacity internally and with our partners. We have work going on indicators and coordination on updates related to CalAdapt and our state's geoportal, and also coordination with our emergency responders. I believe Michael will talk a little bit more about the work to update our general plan guidelines and work to support local governments. But really the kind of take-home message of all of this is that all these state efforts are weaving together along with the State Priority Plan as part of our coordinated response to climate change. However, the real implementation of all these efforts, again, depends heavily on our collaboration and engagement with a variety of partners, including our tribal, federal, regional, and local government, as well as nonprofits, industry, and business partners. And only through working together can we successfully meet those challenges ahead. So I'll go ahead and jump a little bit more into the actual safeguarding plan and give you just a quick preview of the document and talk a little bit about our timeline. The document is organized around 9 sectors. We have 2 more sectors than were identified in 2009. We've added a chapter on emergency management, and we've also broken apart our energy and transportation sector to have their own individual chapters. And while it is organized around sectors, there has been a very concerted effort to focus on cross-sector priorities and coordination. And I think if you look at the document, you'll really see that reflected throughout all the chapters with cross-referencing and links between those sectors. And I'll talk a little bit more about our specific cross-sector recommendations in just a minute. But again, just even though we have organized the document around these sectors, we have taken great steps to break down those silos and really identify those cross-sector those needs. Another new addition to these sector chapters is the addition of first-person narratives, which offer kind of a different perspective on climate risk. In some cases, I think provide a more personal feel for what climate change means to us as Californians. And again, it's kind of another way that we in state government are trying to reach out and to really engage different communities and different groups in this conversation on climate change adaptation. Within each of these sector chapters, there's a discussion of climate risk to the sector. There's also a discussion of accomplishments. And I think this is another really important part of the document because a lot of great work has gone on since 2008 when we were all trying to figure out what this meant. There has been this amazing upswell of, as I mentioned, just really creative and innovative projects and things that are really helping us to really get climate change thinking into our work and get those actions on the ground. And another important role I think this accomplishments plays, we don't always do a great job of communicating these accomplishments, but this is kind of one step in talking about not only what the state is doing, but I would say a good portion of this work has happened because of the collaboration with our partners. Another section of the adaptation strategy is to really focus on specific actions, and we've spent a considerable amount of time coming up with what we feel are really realistic, sector-specific recommendations that are specific to the sector yet also tie into supporting the larger vision. So again, it's important to keep in mind that this is a state policy guidance document, so it's really written to inform our statewide actions, and but to be really tied into those more kind of down in the weeds actions that are being developed and led by our various state agencies and departments who have oversight in those sectors. So on this slide, you'll see just a few examples I've pulled out from each sector, but again, it gives you a flavor for what's in the document, and I would encourage you to look over those actions, specifically if there's a sector that you're interested in and looking for those kind of cross-sector linkages. As I mentioned earlier, there has been a really strong focus on our cross-sector needs, and I pulled out this kind of abbreviated list of our 7 key cross-sectors. But for all of state government, we have this very strong focus and pulled out these key recommendations around integrating climate risk or mainstreaming climate risk considerations into all of our government functions. We also need to have a very strong focus on protecting our vulnerable populations, and then focusing on identifying significant and sustainable funding. There's a continued commitment to supporting climate research and data and tools to inform our policies and our decisions on the ground. And then also a very strong discussion happening and commitment to maximizing returns on investments. And this really focuses on that nexus between adaptation and mitigation, and how we prioritize projects that have multiple benefits to promote sustainable stewardship of resources, while also meeting our needs to reduce emissions. Another very important part of this is prioritizing climate risk communication, education, and outreach, and then to promote a collaborative and iterative process to craft and refine our risk management strategies over time. So again, these are the larger kind of cross-sector strategies that are identified for all sectors and for state government. And then as you start to dig down into the individual sectors, you'll see more specific recommendations for each of those sectors. A little bit about our timeline in creating this document. In early July, we held advanced tribal outreach and listening sessions with our tribal nations. And then in September and October, held a series of 5 regional public workshops around the state to really hear from our NGOs, our local communities, various groups about what their big concerns were with adaptation, where they were in the state of adaptation planning and awareness, and what things were really critical that they wanted to see highlighted in the state's approach. In December, we released our public draft, and then in January held additional public workshops and tribal consultations, both in Sacramento and San Francisco, but also 2 other meetings in Los Angeles that took place in the last 2 weeks. We will have our public comment period open until the end of February, and then hope to finalize the final safeguarding plan in the spring of 2014. We're looking forward to a really robust public review process and an opportunity to work across government agencies and with our partners in the public to finalize this collaborative vision for safeguarding California from climate risk now and in the future. And we hope that if you're interested, that you'll take a look at this also and provide input, and feel free to contact me with any questions. But before I close and turn this over to Michael, I do want to deviate just a little bit from the safeguarding plan to also talk about an effort that the state is working on to support the implementation of our vision around climate education, outreach, and partnership, and the desire to build a real strong network of practitioners in the state. And this really stems from being involved with the National Adaptation Forum and building off the success of that event. There was a very strong contingent of Californians at that event, and there was a realization that while this national event was incredibly important, we also needed to start building those same networks within California. And I'll give strong kudos to Michael McCormick for really pushing us to take that jump to create a California-based event. And our California Adaptation Forum is an affiliate event of the National Forum. And again, really focused on how we build a partnership around the state, around these issues. So through a really unique partnership between the Local Government Commission, our Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and the California Natural Resource Agency, we have begun to lay the groundwork for our 2014 California Adaptation Forum. It'll be held this summer here in Sacramento, with again the goal of bringing multiple levels of government together with our NGOs, academic community, businesses, civic leaders, to really accelerate action in the state and to build that network of practitioners to support our work. In the same spirit of the National Adaptation Forum, we have designed this event to be anything but your ordinary conference. We are not coming to listen and be lectured to, but you're actually coming to interact, contribute, and build alliances that will better support the vision and actions that we are taking in our communities here in California. Just a few important events. We're getting ready to, I believe today, put out our call for session proposals and open our registration. And if you're interested in hearing more about that California event, there's more information at the website. And, you know, another thing that we really intend is that even this California event is affiliated with NAF, and we plan to have another very strong showing of California presence at NAF and to be able to report out to our colleagues from around the country about what, you know, what happens this summer and our ongoing efforts and leadership in the state. So with that, I will just close and say thank you again for the time to, you know, give you this update on what we're doing here in California, and happy to answer any questions when that time is appropriate. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to introduce Michael McCormick, who's a great colleague and friend, and has been doing really incredible work in with our local and regional governments, and it's been a real pleasure to work with Michael, so I'm happy to tag team this with him.
Michael, are you there? Have you muted yourself? Michael, can you talk now? Okay. I think we have unmuted you on this end.
Yeah. So I was muted by one of you, so I'm happy I was able to get back in. So thank you so much for hosting this call, Laura and the Adapt team. I was at the National Adaptation Forum and feel the ongoing dialogue the NAF created is a really important part of the conversation on how we move forward nationwide on the issue. For those of you unfamiliar, I'm with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. We constitute the state comprehensive planning entity. So we're the local government liaison. We deal with most land use issues. We manage the California Environmental Quality Act in partnership with the Natural Resources Agency. And we manage general plan guidelines. We're the military affairs liaison. And we have a number of other statutory roles as well. But one of our primary roles is facilitating conversations between our agencies and departments on moving forward on issues of priority to the sitting governor. So Governor Brown, one of his big priorities is climate change. So we spend a lot of time working with our partner agencies and departments on the issue. Next slide, please. So, but when we talk about climate change, and you know, today's focused on adaptation and resilience, but we really need to recognize that unless we significantly reduce our emissions and reduce them quickly, we may have trouble adapting to what's coming. So one of our core resonating themes in the work we do on climate change is that we don't just deal with mitigation or adaptation, we need to deal with both of them and deal with both of them actively. So when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, we have pretty strong goals. By 2050, we're looking at having an 80% reduction below 1990 levels, which is it's an achievable goal, we think. We may not have the technology or the policies in place right now to achieve those goals, but we are quickly working towards that. We are on track to meet our 2020 reduction goal, which is going back to 1990 levels by 2020. Just a real quick example of what kind of work it will take to get to our 2050 80% goal is when we think about the transportation sector, about 85% of the vehicles on the road in 2050 will need to be zero-emission vehicles. And for the most part, that likely means they're going to be electric vehicles, and they'll be plugging into the grid. But what that means is that the grid will also need to be near zero emission. So we have a lot of transformation that needs to be done between now and then, and incorporating you know, thoughts around population growth. We currently have about 38 million people. We anticipate having about 50 million people in 2050, and we're also having to deal with resilience and adaptation issues at the same time. So as we move forward, we have to think about mitigation and adaptation together. Next slide, please. So over the past few years since Governor Brown's taken office, we've been working to really align many of the efforts within the state and with our external partners at the federal, regional, and local level to work together on creating a consistent path forward on climate. And I'm going to go back to focus on resilience now, but really talk about that local and regional context. We have about 40 different state plans that have been updated or being updated in the past year. It's a really exciting opportunity as we've been able to integrate both adaptation and emissions reductions into the vast majority of these plans. Some of these plans have never even talked about climate change before, and it's a great opportunity to make sure that there is institutionalization of the consideration of climate. And we've been working really closely with our local and regional partners to identify what they need from the state and how we can bring some resources to the table. I'm going to go into that a little bit more later in the presentation. Awareness of extreme events has expanded quite a bit in the past couple of years, particularly this year with the drought. There's strong awareness of how sensitive our infrastructure can be to environmental impacts, which has also allowed us to raise the awareness of the coming impacts from climate change and some of the effects that we're already feeling from climate change. And federal recognition has also been a huge part of how we've been able to move forward. Our partnerships with the White House CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, our relationship through the President's Task Force, our work with the various other federal agencies working on climate has been a huge part of how we've been able to make progress to date through funding, tools, resources, convening opportunities. We hosted the President's Task Force meeting, the second meeting in Los Angeles last week. We felt the conversation went very well. We had representatives from all around the country here to talk about how we're moving forward as a nation. And so we look forward to continuing that collaboration as we move forward on these efforts that really resonate. Regional planning has really become a huge part of how we're going to move forward on implementation. I'll talk about that in a minute. And the revolution that's taking place right now regarding data, tools, information, and how we're bringing resources together is also a part of what I'm going to talk about in a minute as well. And lastly, and Amber mentioned this as well, but institutionalizing climate change in almost everything that we do, really normalizing the discussion. It's not something that should be done on the side in an independent effort. It should really be integrated into every major policy and funding decision we make at the state. And that's our end goal, and that's what we're working towards. Next slide, please. So we have a number of great resources that we've been working with to help our local and regional folks understand what we're trying to do at the state and help them to do the work that they need to do. Many of the efforts that we have in place at the state level are responding to local leadership. We found that our local and regional partners have really gone beyond to really create some leadership within the state. So we've been able to integrate much of their ideas and thoughts and programs into the work that we're doing. The general plan guidelines is one place where we have a unifying opportunity between all the various plans and programs that are being developed or have been developed recently. It's basically the guidelines for how local governments develop general plans. In other parts of the country, they're comprehensive plans. And so we are integrating climate throughout the guidelines document, basically asking local governments to include discussions of emissions and adaptation throughout the document. And we have some resources to help support that through the auspices of the California Public Utility Commission. The State Energy Efficiency Collaborative was established to support tools and resources for local governments for doing greenhouse gas emissions work and developing climate action templates. So we're updating those to include adaptation and resilience, and we'll be folding those into the general plan guidelines. The GeoPortal, I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's a huge opportunity to bring state resources together with our local, regional, and federal partners. Urban Footprint is a scenario planning tool that we've been working on developing through funding through the Strategic Growth Council. which allows us to visualize changes in land use over time and how it will impact a number of different variables. You can just Google urban footprint and you'll be able to pull up some of the materials for that. The CalAdapt revision is in process as well. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And we've also been working in partnership with the local government commission to develop a AmeriCorps program called Civic Spark. We have all these fantastic guides and tools that are being developed, but if local governments don't have the resources to actually use them and implement them, then we've lost a huge opportunity. So we're proposing an AmeriCorps program that will place about 45 members throughout the state in regional entities and use them as circuit riders to support local action on climate, renewables, and adaptation and resilience. Next slide, please. So the Adaptation Planning Guide is another resource that was developed as a response to the governor's order in 2008, which developed the first California Adaptation Strategy in 2009. So this is a guide which outlines how local governments should plan for adaptation and develop an adaptation plan. It's really the resource that we're pointing to for support of general plans and local hazard mitigation plans. But we've also realized with the propagation of online tools to support greenhouse gas emissions analysis that we needed a way to do the same thing with the adaptation. So we're in talks right now with a couple of different organizations and the federal government to figure out how the Adaptation Planning Guide can be turned into an online resource. The other piece of this is that CalAdapt, which is our primary visualization tool for cal-adapt.org, our primary visualization tool for the impacts of climate change in our communities. And we're able to link that in through this online interface and hopefully create a really efficient tool to both look at the impacts on our communities and identify a process for planning for resilience. There's a number of sea level rise discussions still taking place. There's been a preponderance of tools out there for sea level rise. We've counted 8 that are 8 separate tools that can be used in California for dealing with sea level rise. So one of the things that we're doing at the California Adaptation Forum is taking an opportunity for groups of folks that are developing tools to come together and identify what purposes each tool should be used for. And so we're excited about this conversation as a part of the Adaptation Forum. You know, Amber mentioned it briefly, but the State Hazard Mitigation Plan has had climate change included in it since 2007. There was a comprehensive update this last year. And we've already had approximately 40 local hazard mitigation plans initiated to update their local plans and integrate those plans in the general plan. The Office of Emergency Services here in California has been great at providing technical support to their local partners, and the Office of Planning and Research has been a part of that discussion as well to link it to our updates to the general plan process. But there's so many other plans and programs. I could talk for the next, how much time do you have? What we can do is we'll send a link out via follow-up to the attendees with the link to the summary document that Amber mentioned that OPR has been managing. So the next slide, please. So the California GeoPortal is an opportunity to bring together a number of resources. Previously within the state, you would have to go to each agency department to access their geospatial data. But now we have a single enterprise-based GeoPortal system, meaning it pulls together the data that's housed in all these independent organizations into a single portal. It's publicly accessible. Not all the layers are up there yet. They're still being vetted. But we see this as a potential revolutionary opportunity for how we do land use in California, providing data to the public, to decision makers, to policy makers, and creating a consistent data source for planning throughout the state. Linking it up to the Office of Emergency Services viewers and through CalAdapt will also create a better connection. So it'll be our standardized hub and portal for how we get geospatial data. And ultimately, the goal is to roll up information from the regional groups, academic institutions, and the federal government where applicable to support better information coming from all of that data. Next slide, please. So the next slide, I briefly talked about this before, but the linkage between CalAdapt and the Adaptation Planning Guide is a really important step into making it easier to plan for the impacts of climate change within our local communities. The Adaptation Planning Guide outlines 9 different steps in the planning process. There's a number of other folks that have developed, stepwise systems on planning for adaptation, but this is the one that we've chosen here and will be incorporated into the online tool. Next slide, please. And one of the more fantastic things that we've been working on is the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation. It's each of the 4 major regions of the state, which represent 80% of the population of the state, in San Diego, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, and the Sacramento region, have come together to form the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives in partnership with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And the intent here is to provide a sharing network, but also to support policy development at the state that responds to the regional needs, and to communicate the state's goals and priorities back to our regional partners. It's also a fantastic opportunity to streamline how we talk about climate within the regions. Previously, if the state wanted to talk with one particular region about what they're doing on adaptation, you'd need to go to a number of different organizations. But at this point, we were able to interface through a single entity like ARCA. There's a lot of things, a lot of moving parts with ARCA right now as it forms. So the MOU was just signed last year, and it's a really interesting experiment in looking at governance structures for each individual region. So I encourage you to visit each of the individual websites of these organizations and take a look at what they're doing. And we also have a landing page for ARCA on the OPR website. So the next slide. So when I talked about all of these things, a lot of it responds to what we've heard from our local partners, and that there's significant constraints in how they're able to do adaptation and resilience planning. We do an annual survey that has a significant response rate of about 85, 87%. And what we found, most people were concerned about financial and budgetary issues, lack of staff, and that other column that you see there is actually governance or lack of direction on how to move forward. So we, to a large extent, have been trying to solve some of these problems so that we can have our local partners have the resources they need to move forward. Next slide. So in the future, we have a lot of things ahead of us. We, as mentioned, we have 40-plus plans that have just been updated. We do have a structure at the state as an umbrella over those plans and programs. We have our great partnerships with federal, regional, local folks. But outreach needs to continue. Our toolkit is going to need to continue to evolve and become more efficient and better structured so it's easier to use. Technology, big data, and open data is a huge part of the conversation moving forward, and how we integrate that into our tool sets is a really important part of the discussion. And acknowledging that there's going to be improvements in policy, improvements in scientific data, and a changing understanding of how the climate's going to change over time. All of those need to be adaptively managed as a part of our process. We are continuing to look to expand our partnerships to international folks, with the federal government, and with our regional and local partners, and really with the end goal of institutionalizing climate change into everything that we do. So next slide. So as a part of this discussion, the Adaptation Forum is a huge opportunity for us to come together and think about how we move forward as a state. We certainly invite participation from folks in other states and the international community. Please do put in a proposal. We have limited slots, but we will accommodate as many as we can. Really looking forward to the conversation. I think I'm going to end it there and take, I know we don't have much time left, but maybe we'll be able to take a couple of questions. Feel free to reach out and contact me if you have any follow-up questions on some of the work that I'd outlined here.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Laura, for your presentations. Even though we are running out of time a little bit. We have a question for one of our attendees. I'm probably going to not pronounce your name correctly, but Shalandra Mandel, do you want to ask the first question? I think you are unmuted.
Yes. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you for a good presentation. I enjoyed the presentation. I'm sorry I joined late. I wanted to know the adaptation resilience planning with respect to city with the context of water, because water is a big issue. Right now I am in Tucson and is a water stressed city. So I wanted to look any innovative ideas, innovative intervention into the California adaptation planning.
Right. So we have a number of resources on planning for the future of water supply in California. Clearly, the California drought has highlighted the need for greater procurement options, greater efficiency, and helping to manage that scarce resource more effectively. As a part of the list of resources that we'll send out, you'll be able to go through that, and there'll be 5 or 6 different resources in there I think you'll find very valuable.
And I would also add, this is Amber, to really encourage you to look at the water sector chapter within the Safeguarding California plan. I think that lays out some kind of very tangible directions and actions we can take, as well as those that are aspirational of where we need to go. So I would encourage you to take a look at that also, and we can add that link to this list of references that Michael's mentioned.
Okay, great. We have a question from Jeffrey Morris. Have any of the adaptation plans helped the California ski industry deal with the current drought?
I didn't get which industry?
Oh, the ski industry, ski industry.
Well, it's interesting. The ski industry has been very engaged in the discussion. Skiers themselves have seen this as a really important issue to get around. And Amber may be able to talk a little bit more about it in context to the Safeguarding California plan. But with our regional partners, folks in Los Angeles and the Sacramento region have certainly been engaged with the ski community and the resorts to talk about snowpack and how it relates to water supply. It's creating some interesting discussions between folks that really have never talked before. When you think about Los Angeles, much of their water supply comes from the Sierras, so it's of interest for both the ski community and urban regions that obtain their water from the Sierras to participate in the same discussion.
I think, Michael, you covered that. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Amber, if you want to follow up on that. Go ahead.
No, I just was going to say one of the unique perspectives that we offered, one of these first-person narratives actually for the water chapter, was from a professional snowboarder. So this is, again, kind of, these larger efforts to reach out and engage in these conversations. As Michael mentioned, the ski industry has definitely, been a part of the conversations. And I think just recently the governor gave away an Environmental Excellence Award for one of our ski resorts up in Sierras for really working collaboratively to do some really innovative work around restoration that is not only benefiting the industry but also, and that company, but also really being good stewards of resources. And so I think that, a lot of these are tied together. We're having these conversations, and they're very important to get everyone to the table because no one entity is going to be able to solve this, and we recognize that we need to, we all have a piece of the puzzle to work on, but it's critically important that we figure out ways that we are communicating and working collaboratively so that our actions are very strategic and intentional.
No, that's very good. We're going to take one last question. We do have several questions that have not been answered, and what we'll do is submit it to our panel members, and we will make it available on the website. The final question is, how important is it to mobilize citizens to participate in these measures, and what steps are you taking to bring this heart and soul element in? And this is from Kevin Preister.
Amber, do you want to start to talk about the safeguarding process?
Yeah, I would just say that it's critical. I mean, again, we recognize that we cannot do this on our own, and especially, the rubber really meets the road in our regions and on the ground, and we need to be figuring out ways for the state to better support, not just the work of our local governments, but also in our community groups. We have a lot of work to do around, we talked about, a real strong focus in the safeguarding plan around protecting vulnerable communities, and that really goes beyond just how we're going to physically protect areas. This is, we have a public health chapter, but really a strong emphasis on building those, those social networks and communities so that it's people protecting people as well in events like Hurricane Sandy and others. So having a robust public input process, having partners there at the table to help us craft and refine this vision for the state, and then looking at how we step down those efforts to work together as a community, I think is really critical. Maybe, Michael, you have some more to add to that?
Yeah, just quickly, part of the work that we're doing right now is figuring out much of the implementation is going to occur on the ground at the local level. Citizens need to support that local action, so the electeds in those communities that are implementing the proposed goals and policies actually are able to accomplish that. When we think about our emissions and adaptation goals, they are going to require the involvement of pretty much everybody in the state. So how to do that is some of the process moving forward. We have not been the best at communicating to our citizens the importance of taking individual action and supporting local decision makers. And so we're working on how to communicate the importance of taking ownership of how we move forward. And our local and regional folks and regional press and media are certainly a part of that, because as a state, we can understand the larger state context, but our regional folks are really the boots on the ground that can communicate best to their constituents and their stakeholders. So that's one more reason to have strong partnerships with our local and regional folks.
And if I can just add one more thing to that, this is Lara. What seems to be the most effective way to make sure that citizens are involved in the implementation and that the implementation is effective is when citizens and other groups are involved, be that municipalities or counties, are involved in the process of designing the adaptation strategies in any state or larger jurisdictional group, or even a city plan. When people are involved early on, you get better long-term outcomes, and that's been shown in things before climate change adaptation, and it's a good practice to carry over here as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Lara, Amber, and Michael for presenting today. Again, presentations and the webinar recording will be available at ecoadapt.org/webinars. The recording will be available on the cakex.org page as well. And the next webinar will be on May 22nd, more focused on the municipality level, and that will be sponsored by the National Wildlife Federation and EcoAdapt. And again, we will try to answer all those questions that were submitted via the question tab. We will post those on that webinar site as well. And any feedback that you have is welcome. And if any of you, again, want to co-sponsor or present on a National Adaptation Forum webinar, please let us know, and we'll be happy to work with you. Thanks, everybody.